Comrades, I speak to you not as a messenger of empty promises, but as a witness to the unvarnished truth of our existence under the chains of capital. Open your eyes, for the world you inhabit is not natural. It is forged by hands you do not see, by labor you do not control, for profits you do not share. The moment you see the system clearly, the moment you recognize the machinery of exploitation for what it is, that is the moment you stop serving it. Understand this: the society we inhabit is structured not for the welfare of the many, but for the enrichment of the few. Capitalism is not a neutral stage upon which we live our lives. It is a precise architecture of oppression, designed to strip the worker of ownership over the fruits of their labor, to alienate the mind from the product, the worker from the work, and the human from their own humanity. Every factory, every office, every marketplace is not a symbol of freedom, it is a tribunal of control, a theatre of submission. Look around you. Those who claim to govern, those who shape the law, do not labour to feed their own needs. They command your labour, your time, your very energy, the commodities you produce, the innovations you create, the sweat you shed, all become instruments of their wealth and their power. Your work is made abstract, your skills reduced to mere units of exchange, your life measured in hours of coerced productivity. The system teaches you to accept this inevitability as natural law. It is neither. It is deliberate. Do not be deceived by the illusions of freedom, the masks of opportunity. Under capitalism, choice is often the choice between exploitation and survival, and progress is measured in profits rather than justice. Every reform, every policy that does not challenge the foundations of capital is a bandage on a wound designed to bleed perpetually. The system is not broken, it is functioning perfectly, exactly as it was designed, to concentrate wealth, to divide the oppressed, to maintain control through ideology, culture, and distraction. But here is the truth that the masters of society fear. Your clarity is power. The moment you see the system for what it is, you recognize your own chains, and chains can be broken. Your alienation, the disconnection from your labor, from your fellow workers, from your own potential, is not an accident. It is a tool wielded to prevent solidarity, to prevent collective action. Yet when the veil falls, when consciousness rises, the worker is no longer isolated. The oppressed are never as weak as they appear when they stand together, when they organize, when they turn shared suffering into a shared force. The call to revolution is not the cry of chaos. It is the demand for justice. It is the insistence that those who produce the wealth of society must also hold power over it. It is the declaration that society's goods are not the inheritance of the few, but the property of all who labor. We are not asking for scraps from the master's table. We are reclaiming the right to shape the table itself, to decide how our lives, our labor, and our communities are organized. Do not mistake despair for inevitability. History is not a tide against which we are powerless. It is the cumulative action of human beings, the product of class struggle, the arena in which the oppressed can seize their destiny. From the Paris Commune to the strikes that shake factories to their foundations, history reminds us, when workers act collectively, when they think collectively, when they refuse to serve a system that dehumanizes them, change becomes not a dream, but an inevitability. Comrades, clarity is not a passive recognition, it is an act of rebellion. To see the system clearly is to see where your power lies, to know that the division imposed between you and your fellow workers is artificial, a tactic of oppression. Organize, educate, unite. Reject the narratives that tell you obedience if virtue and suffering is natural. Refuse to. Consent to your own exploitation. For every act of conscious defiance, every moment in which you recognize the chains and do not bend to them, you weaken the fortress of capital. Remember this: no law, no authority, no cultural ritual can legitimize the theft of your labor, the manipulation of your desires, or the commodification of your life. Power lies not in the hands of those who own capital, but in the hands of those who produce it. Every hour you labor without control is a seed of revolution waiting to bloom. Every act of solidarity is a strike against the structure that binds you. Every spark of awareness is the ignition of the fire that will dismantle the system. The moment you see the system clearly, you stop serving it. You stop believing in its inevitabilities. You stop internalizing its lies. You refuse to be a cog, a tool, a passive observer of your own oppression. You become the architect of change, the bearer of collective consciousness, the force that turns discontent into organized action. The moment is now. The clarity is yours. And from this clarity, nothing can stand in your way if you move as one. To see the world as it truly is, without the distortions of ideology or the comforting lies of tradition, is to step into a space of immense danger and immense power. Clarity is not merely intellectual, it is revolutionary, for it illuminates the mechanisms that bind us and the chains we have been trained to accept as natural. The first act of liberation is the act of seeing, and to see the system for what it is requires courage, honesty, and the willingness to confront truths that have been hidden behind rhetoric, culture, and the false promises of freedom. Capitalism presents itself as a neutral arena where merit and effort determine reward, where opportunity exists for those who strive, but these are illusions designed to obscure the real distribution of power. Labor is transformed into a commodity, human creativity into profit for the few, and the majority are told to accept scarcity, competition, and inequality as inevitable laws. To understand this is to awaken, for awakening is the realization that our servitude is neither natural nor unavoidable. Every institution we encounter, schools, workplaces, media, politics, is designed to reproduce the logic of domination, to train us to perform roles that serve the accumulation of wealth by a minority. Clarity involves tracing the threads of power through these institutions, seeing how laws and customs operate, not to ensure justice, but to ensure compliance, not to enrich life, but to extract value from labor. When one grasps the depth of this structure, one perceives that the social relations that appear ordinary, that seem inevitable, are in fact the product of human design and human interest. The recognition that the system is deliberate, that exploitation is purposeful, is profoundly destabilizing, for it undermines the narratives that have long shaped our understanding of society. But this destabilization is also the very ground upon which liberation is built, for one cannot rebel against forces one does not understand. Clarity is inseparable from self-awareness. To refuse to serve the system, one must first recognize how one has been serving it, often unconsciously, through complicity, obedience, or indifference. Every hour spent producing wealth without control, every act of participation in a social order that commodifies life, every moment in which one internalizes the values of the ruling class, constitutes a form of service. To see this is painful, for it involves acknowledging one's own role in sustaining structures of oppression, yet it is also empowering, for it identifies the precise leverage points where resistance can be enacted. Awareness transforms alienation into agency, discontent into direction, and confusion into strategic insight. The system thrives on division and distraction, on convincing individuals that their struggles are personal, failures rather than expressions of structural inequality. Clarity disrupts this deception by connecting individual experience to collective conditions. To understand that poverty, exploitation, and inequality are not accidents of chance or results of moral weakness, but systematic products of class relations, is to shift the perception from resignation to resistance. Workers, students, and all who produce social wealth begin to recognize their shared position, the commonality of their exploitation, and the potential power that lies in solidarity. Knowledge of the system illuminates both the chains that bind and the tools that can break them, revealing the paths through which collective action becomes both possible and necessary. To refuse to serve the system is not merely a withdrawal from participation, but an active engagement in reshaping social reality. It is a rejection of obedience, a refusal to internalize the values and goals of those who benefit from exploitation. The moment of clarity carries with it the responsibility to organize, to educate, and to mobilize. One's own awakening becomes a catalyst for others, for consciousness spreads like fire when nurtured by dialogue, reflection, and shared struggle. The system fears clarity, because it recognizes that understanding precedes action, that consciousness is the first material force of rebellion, that when the oppressed see the architecture of their subjugation, they also see the contours of their liberation. Clarity transforms the perception of labor, of wealth, and of social relations. Work ceases to be a neutral task, it becomes a site of potential liberation. Consumption ceases to be mere indulgence, it becomes a measure of social relation. Every interaction, every institution, every law can be read through the lens of power and inequality. Understanding the system in this way is not an intellectual exercise detached from life, it is the first act of intervention, the initial step toward refusing to serve, toward refusing to consent to the alienation of one's own labor, toward refusing to participate passively in one's own oppression. The moment clarity arrives, the worker, the student, the marginalized, the oppressed, the exploited no longer exist as passive subjects in the system script. They begin to rewrite the terms of their existence, to imagine the society they will not serve but will shape, to see liberation not as a distant dream, but as a tangible horizon that emerges through understanding, resistance, and collective action. Capitalism is not a neutral stage upon which human life unfolds. It is a meticulously designed system of oppression, created and maintained to serve the interests of a wealthy few while subjugating the many. The extraction of surplus value from labor is its engine, the commodification of human effort its method, and the concentration of wealth and power its goal. Every relationship under this system is refracted through the prism of profit, every institution molded to ensure compliance, and every human being measured by their usefulness to the market. The worker is alienated at every level of existence, torn from the product of their labor, the act of creation itself, and from the solidarity that could make resistance possible. This alienation is not accidental, it is the deliberate condition upon which capitalism thrives, for a fragmented and distracted workforce is incapable of challenging the structures that exploit it. Workers are separated from the products they create. Every item produced, every service performed, every intellectual or physical effort is taken from the laborer, transformed into a commodity, and sold for profit by those who did not contribute their effort. The worker sees the product of their labor but cannot claim it, cannot shape it, and rarely benefits from it beyond the wages that barely sustain life. This separation is the first and most profound form of alienation, for it reduces human creativity to an instrument of capital, erases the connection between effort and outcome, and teaches the mind to accept that one's own life is a tool to enrich another. In this way, the laborer becomes a stranger to their own work, a passive participant in a system that extracts value without reciprocating dignity or freedom. Capitalism also alienates workers from the labor process itself. Work is no longer an expression of human potential. It becomes a repetitive, mechanized task, dictated by rules designed to maximize efficiency and profit rather than to foster growth, satisfaction, or creativity. The clock governs existence, not necessity or desire, and the worker's energy is transformed into profit through coercion, habit, and social expectation. The system teaches that fulfillment comes not from self-realization or collective achievement, but from compliance, productivity, and the accumulation of wages that remain insufficient to challenge dependence on capital. Labor is thus stripped of its meaning, and the human being is reduced to a functionary within a machine whose gears are controlled by the few. Furthermore, capitalism deliberately isolates workers from one another. Division is the method through which dominance is maintained. By fostering competition, cultivating distrust, and privileging individual advancement over collective strength, the system ensures that solidarity is rare and difficult to achieve. Workers are pitted against one another for scarce resources, recognition, and security, making collective organization appear unnatural or even dangerous. This social fragmentation is essential to capitalism, for a united working class, aware of its shared exploitation, is the most potent threat to the accumulation of wealth. Alienation is therefore both material and social. It is a structure that produces loneliness, suspicion, and dependence on the very system that oppresses. The concentration of wealth is the inevitable outcome of this deliberate oppression. Labour is alienated from product and process. As workers are isolated from one another, surplus value flows upward to those who own the means of production. The disparity between rich and poor is not a consequence of talent or effort, but the design of a system that ensures the few control the many. Luxury, power, and comfort are hoarded by a tiny minority, while the masses struggle under insecurity, debt, and exploitation. Every law, every institution, every cultural narrative is bent to justify this inequality, to naturalize the dominance of capital, and to convince the oppressed that their condition is a personal failure rather than a systemic strategy. Capitalism's oppression is both structural and ideological. It relies on more than just economic coercion. It shapes perception, desire, and thought. The system teaches that inequality is inevitable, that labor must be sacrificed for security, that competition is virtuous, and that solidarity is naive. In doing so, it not only extracts material wealth but also manipulates consciousness, making rebellion seem impossible, discontent personal, and complicity necessary. The alienation of labor, product, and community is therefore mirrored in the alienation of thought, as the mind internalizes the hierarchy imposed by capital and sees it as natural rather than imposed. The moment workers recognize these dynamics, they begin to see that capitalism is not neutral, not accidental, and not beneficial to the majority. It is a deliberate system of oppression designed to extract wealth, fragment the oppressed, and reproduce power in the hands of a few. The recognition of this fact is the first step toward dismantling it, for once the mechanisms are understood, the possibility of resistance becomes visible. Alienation is not permanent, and wealth is not immutable. When labourers stop seeing themselves as mere cogs and begin to understand the design of the system, they see both the injustice of their condition and the means to transform it. Under capitalism, freedom is often spoken of as though it were a natural right, an inherent condition of human existence, yet the reality is quite the opposite. The system constructs and sells illusions of freedom while simultaneously constraining, directing, and exploiting the lives of those who believe themselves to be free. Reforms are offered, concessions are granted, and choices are presented, but these are not genuine manifestations of liberty. They are mechanisms to pacify the oppressed, to create the appearance of agency, and to maintain the power of those who own and control the means of production. The freedom to consume, to vote, or to select among alternatives within a framework designed to extract labor and value is no freedom at all. It is the freedom to choose how one will serve the system, not whether one will serve it. Every so-called reform, every policy designed to improve conditions, functions as a pressure-release valve. It alleviates the most visible tensions without challenging the fundamental structure of exploitation. Minimum wages, social programs, regulations, or labor protections, while seemingly benevolent, are permitted only because they sustain the overall system by reducing unrest, creating the illusion of fairness, and preventing organized resistance. They do not challenge the extraction of surplus value or the alienation of workers, they merely obscure it. Workers are taught to see incremental gains as victories, to believe that slow improvement is equivalent to justice, and to conflate survival under exploitation with liberation. The system encourages gratitude for scraps while the feast remains monopolized by the wealthy few. Choice, too, is a weapon of control. In capitalist societies, individuals are presented with a multiplicity of options, yet these options are always circumscribed by the needs of capital. One may choose between employers, brands, lifestyles, or political candidates, but these choices rarely alter the underlying conditions of inequality. To the worker, the appearance of autonomy masks the reality that the same fundamental forces govern the options themselves. Labor remains alienated, wealth remains concentrated, and dependence on the system persists. The illusion of choice serves to occupy the mind, to redirect energy into trivial preferences rather than collective action, and to obscure the collective power that comes from understanding one's shared position within a system of exploitation. Capitalism excels at transforming the coercion of labor into consent. It presents work not as obligation but as opportunity, exploitation not as theft but as compensation, and hierarchy not as domination but as meritocracy. Individuals internalize these narratives, believing that their position is the result of personal effort, talent, or virtue rather than the systematic distribution of power. Ideology becomes the invisible chain, a subtle yet powerful form of control that convinces people to participate in the very system that exploits them. Freedom in this sense is a carefully constructed mirage. It is freedom within limits determined by those who profit, a freedom that maintains dependence while masquerading as autonomy. The danger of these illusions is that they fragment consciousness, teaching individuals to see themselves as isolated actors navigating a neutral system rather than as members of a class whose collective power could challenge it. Reforms that appear to expand freedom often reinforce the very boundaries they seem to dissolve. They create a sense of progress without changing the conditions of alienation, inequality, or control. Workers may feel empowered by small victories, yet the mechanisms of exploitation remain intact, invisible to all but the conscious observer. The system is resilient because it hides its methods behind symbols, rituals, and narratives that seem natural, inevitable, or benevolent, and it is clarity alone that pierces this illusion. True liberation cannot be achieved by choosing between options offered within a framework designed to exploit, nor by relying on incremental reforms that leave the foundations untouched. It arises from understanding the difference between real freedom and the semblance of freedom, between structural change and superficial concession. The moment the worker recognizes that the choices presented by capitalism are designed to control, that the reforms permitted by the system are designed to pacify, they begin to see the contours of genuine liberation. Awareness of these illusions exposes the system's dependence on consent, showing that exploitation is maintained not only by force or coercion, but by the manipulation of perception and belief. Once this understanding emerges, the oppressed begin to see the pathways to reclaiming autonomy and agency. They realize that true freedom is not a menu of alternatives offered by the ruling class, but the power to determine the conditions of life collectively. Illusions no longer bind the mind, and the energy once expended in navigating the system's traps can be redirected toward organizing, solidarity, and resistance. The consciousness that discerns the tools of control also discerns the levers of liberation, recognizing that reforms and choices under capitalism are instruments of compliance until they are transformed into tools of collective empowerment. Power is not granted, it is seized. True social transformation never emerges from the goodwill of those who benefit from exploitation, but from the conscious organization of those who labor under oppression. The history of human progress is the history of struggle between classes, a record of conflict in which those who produce the wealth of society have repeatedly confronted those who hoard it. Yet this power can only be realized when workers recognize their shared position, understand the conditions that bind them, and unite to act collectively. Fragmentation, division, and isolation are the instruments of oppression, while solidarity, shared purpose, and collective consciousness are the instruments of liberation. The moment workers recognize that their strength lies not in individual effort but in collective action, the structures of domination begin to tremble. Under capitalism, the worker is alienated not only from the product of their labor and from the act of labor itself, but also from their fellow workers. The system relies on this isolation, cultivating competition, suspicion, and individualism to prevent the formation of unity. Workers are taught to see each other as rivals for jobs, wages, or recognition, rather than as allies in a common struggle against exploitation. Class consciousness is obscured by ideology, culture, and the daily demands of survival, leaving the worker to believe that suffering and inequality are personal failures rather than systemic phenomena. It is only when these illusions are stripped away, when the individual recognizes that oppression is shared, that the seeds of collective power can take root. Collective action transforms discontent into force. Discontent in isolation may fester as despair, resentment, or resignation, but when it is articulated collectively, it becomes a material force capable of challenging the foundations of society. Strikes, protests, unions, cooperatives, and organized movements are not simply responses to immediate grievances. They are manifestations of class consciousness, expressions of the understanding that the oppressed are strongest when they act together. Every successful instance of collective action, from labor strikes that win concessions to revolutions that reshape society, demonstrates that the unity of the working class is the ultimate threat to the domination of capital. Individual effort alone is powerless to dismantle the system, but united effort is unstoppable, for it harnesses the energy, creativity, and labor of the majority against the concentrated power of the few. Class consciousness is both awareness and strategy. Awareness involves recognizing one's exploitation, seeing the structures and mechanisms of power, and understanding one's role in the production of social wealth. Strategy involves translating that awareness into organized, coordinated action designed to achieve material goals and systemic change. Without consciousness, collective action may be directionless or co-opted. Without organization, awareness alone cannot overcome entrenched structures of oppression. The two must work in tandem, for knowledge without action is impotent, and action without knowledge is aimless. The worker who sees the chains that bind them and understands that others share these chains becomes the agent of transformation. And when many such agents unite, society itself becomes contestable. Unity is not spontaneous. It must be forged through education, dialogue, and the building of trust across the ranks of the oppressed. Workers must recognize that their differences, language, region, skill, or background are tools of division used by the ruling class, and that solidarity across these differences is essential. Class consciousness demands empathy, patience, and rigorous understanding, for the strength of the collective lies in the ability of individuals to see their own interests as inseparable from the interests of the whole. When workers act collectively, their efforts multiply, the labor of one becomes the labor of many, and the power of many overwhelms the defenses of the few. The revolutionary potential of collective action is not merely reactive, it is constructive. It is not only about dismantling exploitation, but about imagining and creating a society in which the means of production, the distribution of wealth, and the organization of labor serve the needs of the many rather than the privileges of the few. It is a vision in which the alienation of labor is abolished, in which human creativity and cooperation are freed, and in which society is shaped by those who produce its wealth rather than those who hoard it. Collective action transforms the worker from a passive subject into an active agent capable of reshaping the social, economic, and political structures that determine life. The lesson is clear. Power resides not in the hands of the wealthy or the ruling elite, but in the hands of those who produce the world, and that power is realized only when the oppressed recognize their shared interests, organize themselves, and act in unity. History repeatedly demonstrates that the solidarity of the working class, informed by consciousness and directed by strategy, is the only force capable of dismantling systemic oppression and constructing a society founded on justice, equality, and human liberation. The recognition of this truth is the catalyst that transforms awareness into action, despair into agency, and division into revolutionary power. Revolution begins not with chaos, not with mindless rebellion, but with conscious defiance. To defy without understanding is to act blindly. To understand without acting is to remain complicit. True liberation emerges when awareness, the recognition of exploitation, alienation, and systemic injustice is coupled with organized, purposeful action. Conscious defiance is the meeting point of knowledge and force, thought and labor, awareness and strategy. It is the moment when the oppressed refuse not only the dictates of capital, but also the internalized beliefs that have taught them to accept domination as natural, inevitable, or deserved. Awareness alone exposes the chains, but it is action that shatters them. And action guided by collective consciousness is the material force capable of dismantling oppression. Awareness is the spark that illuminates the mechanisms of power. It is the realization that labor is alienated, that wealth is concentrated, that inequality is structured, and that the norms and institutions that seem neutral are designed to perpetuate domination. When the worker, the student, or the marginalized individual recognizes that their suffering is not accidental, that it is neither personal failure nor moral deficiency, a profound shift occurs. The mind, previously disciplined to consent, begins to question, to analyze, and to resist. Awareness exposes the illusion of neutrality, the facade of freedom, and the myth of meritocracy. It reveals the precise ways in which the system thrives on compliance, distraction, and division, and it identifies the points at which resistance can be effective. But awareness without defiance is inert, for knowledge alone cannot alter the material conditions that enforce oppression. Action transforms awareness into power. Every organized strike, every coordinated protest, every collective refusal to accept exploitation is a declaration that the system's authority is neither absolute nor legitimate. Conscious defiance is not mere rebellion for its own sake. It is deliberate, strategic, and directed at dismantling the structures that maintain inequality. The difference between mere resistance and revolutionary defiance lies in organization and purpose. Isolated acts of disobedience, though morally significant, are easily neutralized, ignored, or co-opted by those in power. Collective, coordinated, and conscious action, however, leverages the material force of those who produce society's wealth, demonstrating that the oppressed hold the keys to transformation. Organization amplifies defiance, converting individual courage into systemic challenge. Workers who unite in strikes, students who mobilize in movements, communities that resist exploitation collectively multiply their impact far beyond what any single person could achieve. Awareness alone illuminates injustice, but organization channels that illumination into tangible disruption of oppressive structures, the assembly of the conscious, the coordination of labor, and the strategic deployment of collective strength become instruments through which the logic of capital is contested. Each act of organized defiance weakens the authority of the oppressor, exposes the fragility of the system, and builds confidence among the oppressed that change is possible. Conscious defiance is inherently transformative. It does not merely resist, it reconstructs. By combining awareness with action, the oppressed begin to imagine and enact an alternative society in which exploitation is not inevitable, alienation is abolished, and the wealth produced by labor serves the needs of all rather than the privileges of a few. Every strike that secures fair conditions, every protest that demands justice, every act of collective disobedience creates the blueprint for a new order. Defiance teaches not only power but also responsibility, for those who act consciously must also cultivate the solidarity, discipline, and vision required to sustain and expand the gains of struggle. The system fears conscious defiance more than passive resentment, because it recognizes that knowledge aligned with collective action is its most potent adversary. Awareness alone can be contained, and disorganized discontent can be suppressed, but the combination of clarity, purpose, and unity presents a force that cannot be ignored, co-opted, or fully defeated. Every successful movement, every revolution in history demonstrates that systemic oppression survives only as long as the oppressed accept it passively. Once the oppressed recognize the architecture of control, organize among themselves, and act deliberately to dismantle it, the foundations of dominance crumble, and a new social order becomes imaginable and attainable. Conscious defiance transforms the individual, the collective, and society itself. It converts alienation into empowerment, ignorance into insight, and suffering into action. It turns knowledge into a material force, solidarity into strategy, and resistance into revolution. To awaken to the mechanisms of oppression is to ignite the spark of rebellion, to organize that awareness into coordinated defiance, is to wield the fire that can reshape society. In this way, every act of conscious defiance, whether large or small, contributes to the dismantling of exploitation, the weakening of domination, and the emergence of a world in which labour, creativity, and human potential are no longer instruments of oppression, but foundations of liberation. Comrades, the path of clarity, of understanding, of conscious defiance is not easy, nor is it safe. But it is inevitable for those who refuse to remain instruments of their own oppression. Every insight into the workings of the system, every recognition of alienation, every moment of shared struggle, and every act of organized resistance builds the force that will dismantle domination. The oppressed are not powerless. They are the architects of society, the creators of wealth, and the arbiters of change. When awareness illuminates injustice, when unity transforms isolation into strength, and when defiance becomes collective and deliberate, the machinery of exploitation falters, and the illusion of inevitability shatters. History belongs to those who see clearly, who act consciously, and who refuse to serve the system that steals their labor, their creativity, and their humanity. The chains that bind are real, but so too is the force of those who rise together. And it is in the knowledge, organization, and collective courage of the many that the foundations of oppression will be broken and a new society built on justice, equality, and human liberation will emerge.